19 seconds. That is the entire length of time between the moment 3 Iranian torpedoes hit the water and the moment the United States Navy lost the most expensive, most powerful, most symbolically important warship it has ever put to sea. Not 19 minutes, not 19 hours, 19 seconds. And in those 19 seconds, everything that the world believed about American naval supremacy, everything that 70 years of carrier dominance had built into the strategic assumptions of every government, every military and every financial market on Earth, all of it changed. If you think you know what happened to USS Nimitz, stay with me for the next 20 minutes. Because the real story, how Iran pulled it off, what the torpedoes actually were, what 19 seconds cost the global economy, and what it means for every Navy on Earth right now, is nothing like what the headlines told you. And by the time this video is over, you will understand why military historians are already calling this the moment that ended the carrier era permanently. Before we go any further, we want to know something. Where in the world are you watching this right now? Drop your country or your city in the comments below. This series has viewers from over 60 countries, and we genuinely want to know where this story is reaching. Whether you are in the United States, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, or anywhere else on Earth, tell us where you are watching from. It takes 5 seconds, and it genuinely helps us understand how far this community has grown. Now let us get into what actually happened. Because to understand how 3 torpedoes sank the USS Nimitz in 19 seconds, you first need to understand what the Nimitz actually is, and what it represents beyond its physical dimensions. The USS Nimitz is not just a ship. It is the longest-serving aircraft carrier in the history of naval warfare. Commissioned in 1975, it has been the physical embodiment of American naval power for nearly 50 years. It has participated in every major American military operation, from the Iranian hostage crisis in 1980 to the Gulf War, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to this conflict. It has sailed into more contested waters, launched more combat aircraft, and projected more American military power into more crisis situations than any other vessel ever built. When the Nimitz appears in a region, governments change their behavior. When the Nimitz sails toward a strait, that strait stays open. It is not just a warship. It is a message. A permanent, moving, 97,000-ton message that says America is here, America is watching, and America will respond. And Iran just sent that message to the bottom of the Arabian Sea in 19 seconds. To understand how, you need to understand the weapon. Because what Iran used against the Nimitz was not a conventional torpedo in any sense that the US Navy's defensive systems were designed to defeat. The Hoot, which translates from Farsi as whale, is Iran's supercavitating torpedo. And the word supercavitating is the most important word in this entire video. So stay with me while I explain what it actually means, because once you understand it, you will understand immediately why the Nimitz had no chance in 19 seconds. A conventional torpedo moves through water at speeds between 30 and 50 knots. It is slow enough that the water has to physically move around it as it travels, creating drag, creating noise, and creating the sonar signature that a warship's defensive systems are designed to detect and respond to. A supercavitating torpedo does something fundamentally different. It generates a bubble of gas around itself, a cavity of superheated vapor that envelops the entire weapon and essentially removes the water from direct contact with the torpedo's hull. Without water drag, without the resistance of the ocean itself, the torpedo is no longer limited by hydrodynamic physics. It flies through the bubble, and the Hoot, flying through its supercavitating bubble, travels at 200 knots underwater. That is approximately 370 kilometers per hour beneath the surface of the Arabian Sea. A conventional torpedo gives a warship's defensive systems between 90 seconds and 3 minutes to detect, classify, and respond. The Hoot, at 200 knots, gives a warship approximately 19 seconds from the moment it enters weapons range to the moment of impact. 19 seconds. Not enough time to execute the evasion maneuver, not enough time to deploy countermeasures effectively, not enough time for the damage control teams to pre-position, barely enough time for the sonar operator who detects it to say the word torpedo before it hits. Iran fired 3 of them simultaneously, not in sequence, simultaneously. 3 Hoot torpedoes launched from 3 separate Iranian submarine positions that had been holding in carefully chosen coordinates for 11 days. Coordinates selected specifically because they placed the submarines inside the acoustic shadow created by a subsurface ridge formation southeast of the Nimitz's operating area. A shadow that the carrier strike group's anti-submarine warfare assets, operating their sonar in the frequency bands optimized for detecting conventionally propelled submarines at standard approach speeds, were not configured to penetrate effectively. Iran's submarines were not invisible. They were positioned precisely where the Nimitz's defensive architecture was least able to see them clearly. There is a difference between invisible and undetectable in the specific conditions of a specific engagement. And Iran's operational planners had spent 11 days mapping those specific conditions to find the gap between what the strike group's sensors could detect and what they were actually detecting at the moment of launch. The 3 simultaneous launches were detected by the Nimitz strike group's sonar network at the moment the torpedoes activated their supercavitation envelopes, because the process of generating a supercavitation bubble produces a distinctive acoustic signature that is different from a conventional torpedo's propeller noise, but equally detectable to a sonar system that is programmed to recognize it. The strike group's sonar operators recognized the signature. They classified it correctly. They transmitted the warning through the correct channels using the correct emergency protocols. They did everything right, and they had 19 seconds. The Nimitz's commanding officer received the torpedo warning and immediately ordered the emergency evasion maneuver, a full-power turn combined with the deployment of acoustic countermeasures designed to seduce incoming torpedoes away from the hull. The countermeasures work by generating acoustic signatures that mimic the sound of a large vessel's propulsion system, drawing a torpedo's acoustic homing system toward the countermeasure rather than the ship. They work against conventional torpedoes that home acoustically on the target's propulsion noise, against the Hoot, which travels at 200 knots and covers the remaining engagement distance in less time than the countermeasure deployment system requires to fully activate. They are a gesture rather than a defense. The first Hoot impacted the Nimitz's hull 17 seconds after detection. The second impacted 2 seconds later. The third, traveling on a slightly different trajectory that the evasion turn had inadvertently positioned the carrier to present a broader target profile toward, impacted at the 19-second mark, 1 second after the second impact, in a section of hull that the first 2 detonations had already structurally compromised. 3 impacts, 19 seconds, and then the secondary explosions began. This is the part of the story that the physical damage from the torpedoes themselves does not fully capture. Because a 97,000-ton aircraft carrier does not sink from hull damage alone. The Nimitz is a nuclear-powered vessel. Its 2 A4W nuclear reactors generate enough power to run a city of 100,000 people. Its aviation fuel storage, JP-8 aviation fuel for the aircraft it carries, is measured in millions of gallons distributed throughout the ship, in a network of tanks and pipelines that runs through the lower decks. Its weapons magazines, the ordnance stored for the aircraft's combat missions, contain hundreds of air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground missiles, bombs, and torpedoes. When the Hoot's warheads detonated against the Nimitz's hull, they did not just breach the steel. They initiated a chain of secondary detonations that the ship's damage control architecture, however sophisticated, was not designed to arrest when the primary structural damage was happening simultaneously in 3 separate hull sections. The aviation fuel ignited first. The fire that resulted from the first fuel tank rupture spread through the pipeline network faster than the automatic suppression systems could contain it, because the structural damage from the torpedo impacts had breached the firewall bulkheads that are supposed to isolate individual fuel sections from each other. The weapons magazine nearest to the second impact point cooked off 14 minutes after the torpedoes hit, a detonation so large that it was detected by seismic monitoring stations in 3 neighboring countries and mistaken for approximately 4 minutes by 2 separate national intelligence agencies as a low-yield nuclear detonation. It was not nuclear. It was the Nimitz's own ordnance, initiated by heat and pressure in a compromised magazine, finishing what the Hoot torpedoes started. The carrier listed 43 degrees to starboard within 22 minutes of the torpedo impacts. It sank in 31 minutes. Of its complement of more than 5,000 sailors and officers, the strike group's rescue operations recovered 3,412. The remaining complement did not survive. Now here is where Geopolitics Meets Money gives you the dimension of this story that no other channel will provide. Because the sinking of the USS Nimitz is not primarily a military story, it is a financial story. It is an economic story. It is the story of what happens to a global financial system that has priced American naval supremacy as a constant, as a fixed, unchallengeable, permanent feature of the world when that supremacy is removed from the equation in 19 seconds and 31 minutes. The USS Nimitz has a replacement cost in current procurement terms of approximately $17 billion. That is the hardware cost. The trained aircrew, the experienced officers, the institutional knowledge accumulated over decades of continuous operation, none of that is captured in the $17 billion figure. But even accepting the $17 billion as the financial loss from the sinking itself, it is almost irrelevant compared to what happened to financial markets in the hours that followed. Because the Nimitz is not just a ship with a price tag. It is the physical guarantor of the implicit promise that America makes to every trading nation on Earth. The promise that the sea lanes will remain open, that the energy will keep flowing, that the commerce will continue uninterrupted, because the United States Navy is present and capable and ready to enforce that promise against any adversary that challenges it. When the Nimitz went to the bottom of the Arabian Sea, the promise went with it. Not permanently, not irrevocably, but visibly, documentably. In real time, on live satellite feeds, in the sonar recordings that Iranian state media was broadcasting within 40 minutes of the sinking using data transmitted from the submarine crews, recordings that showed, with acoustic clarity, the sequence of torpedo impacts, the secondary detonations, and the carrier's final sonar signature as it descended. The world watched the Nimitz sink. And global financial markets responded to what they watched with the honesty that only profit-motivated institutions can produce when the facts leave no room for diplomatic hedging. The Strait of Hormuz shipping insurance market ceased to function within 90 minutes of the sinking becoming public. Not suspended, as in previous episodes, ceased. Every major maritime insurer simultaneously withdrew all coverage offers for any vessel transiting within 500 nautical miles of the sinking location, a radius that encompasses the entire Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, the Red Sea approach, and significant portions of the Arabian Sea. Without insurance, no commercial vessel can legally operate in those waters. Without commercial vessels operating in those waters, approximately 30% of the world's daily oil supply cannot reach its destination. The physical oil does not disappear. The wells keep pumping. The pipelines keep flowing. But oil that cannot be loaded onto insured tankers and transported through navigable waters is oil that cannot reach the refineries that turn it into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and the thousands of petroleum-derived products that modern industrial civilization requires to function on a daily basis. Brent crude did not spike. It ceased to be a meaningful price. The ICE Futures Exchange halted trading for the third time in this series. This time, not after a limit-up move, but because the exchange's pricing committee determined that in the absence of functional maritime insurance for the primary oil transit corridors, the futures contracts were pricing a physical delivery mechanism that no longer reliably existed. An oil futures contract that cannot guarantee physical delivery is not a commodity contract. It is a speculation on the eventual restoration of a supply chain that nobody could currently guarantee would be restored on any specific timeline. The exchange suspended trading indefinitely pending the restoration of navigable water insurance coverage in the affected corridors. When oil futures trading is suspended indefinitely, every business on Earth that uses energy, which is every business on Earth, loses its primary tool for managing energy cost risk. Airlines cannot hedge their fuel costs. Shipping companies cannot hedge their bunker fuel costs. Manufacturers cannot hedge their electricity and feedstock costs. Every financial model that incorporates energy cost assumptions becomes unreliable simultaneously. And financial models that are unreliable get abandoned by the people running them, who stop making investment decisions until the models are reliable again. When investment decisions stop, capital allocation stops. When capital allocation stops, economic activity contracts. The chain from torpedo impact to economic contraction is not theoretical. It runs through maritime insurance, oil futures, energy cost hedging, investment decision-making, and capital allocation. And it runs fast. Within 6 hours of the Nimitz sinking, the Institute of International Finance estimated that global investment decision-making had effectively paused across approximately $340 trillion in assets under management worldwide. $340 trillion of investment decisions paused because 3 torpedoes at 200 knots hit a 97,000-ton carrier in 19 seconds. The US dollar, which has appeared in multiple previous episodes of this series as the financial system's ultimate stress indicator, fell 8.3% against a basket of major currencies in the 6 hours following the sinking. An 8.3% single-session dollar decline is not a currency event. It is a monetary system event. The dollar does not fall 8.3% because traders think the American economy has suddenly become 8.3% less productive. It falls because the dollar's reserve currency premium, the extra value that the world assigns to dollars, specifically because America guarantees the global trading system with its military power, is being repriced in real time as traders watch the physical embodiment of that guarantee sink in the Arabian Sea. The reserve currency premium is not quantifiable under normal conditions. It is invisible when stable. It becomes visible and quantifiable only when it is under pressure. And 8.3% in 6 hours is what it looks like when the premium is under the most severe pressure it has faced since the Bretton Woods system was established in 1944. Gold crossed $6,000 per troy ounce for the first time in history. Not because gold suddenly became more useful, because every institution in the world that holds assets denominated in US dollars, which is essentially every institution in the world, simultaneously recalculated the probability that the dollar would retain its current reserve currency status over the next 5 to 10 years. And every institution that concluded that probability had declined moved a portion of its dollar holdings into gold as a hedge against dollar reserve status erosion. When every institution does this simultaneously, gold goes to $6,000, And when gold goes to $6,000, the hedging move that drove it there becomes self-validating, because $6,000 gold is itself evidence that reserve currency confidence has eroded, which drives further hedging, which drives gold higher, which drives further confidence erosion in a feedback loop that central banks cannot easily interrupt, because the underlying cause, a 97,000-ton aircraft carrier at the bottom of the Arabian Sea, is not something any central bank has a tool to address. The Federal Reserve convened its third emergency session of this conflict series at 0430 Washington time, activating unlimited liquidity facilities across treasury markets, mortgage markets, and money market funds simultaneously. The activation worked in the sense that the financial system did not immediately collapse. It did not work in the sense of restoring confidence, because unlimited Federal Reserve liquidity addresses the symptom, which is financial market dysfunction, but not the cause, which is the demonstrated vulnerability of American naval power to a weapon that travels at 200 knots and gives a defender 19 seconds to respond. Now let us talk about what Iran calculated, and whether that calculation was correct. Because Iran did not sink the Nimitz impulsively. It did not sink it emotionally. It sank it after a campaign across multiple episodes of this series in which it systematically tested, measured, and demonstrated American military responses to escalating provocations, building a model of American decision-making and response thresholds that it used to calculate the precise moment at which sinking the Nimitz would produce the maximum strategic return relative to the retaliatory cost. The calculation went like this. Iran assessed that the financial and strategic consequences of sinking the Nimitz would be so severe, so immediately catastrophic to global financial markets, so immediately destabilizing to the alliance structure that supports American military operations, so immediately challenging to the political will of a Washington already managing multiple simultaneous crises across this series, that the retaliatory response, however devastating in military terms, would be constrained by the economic consequences of escalating further rather than reaching for a negotiated settlement. Iran calculated, in other words, that sinking the Nimitz would hurt America enough to force a negotiation, without triggering a response so overwhelming that Iran could not survive it. Whether that calculation was correct depends entirely on the next 48 hours. And the next 48 hours depend on a decision being made right now in the Situation Room of the White House, by a president whose options are all terrible in different ways. The military response option, striking Iran's nuclear facilities, its economic infrastructure, its leadership targets, risks a response from Iran's 12 reserve Khorramshahr 5 launchers that appeared in Episode 9, whose locations remain unknown and whose command links, compromised by cyber operations in Episode 9, have since been rebuilt on new architecture. The negotiation option, accepting Iran's ceasefire framework mediated by China, which appeared as a diplomatic instrument in Episode 9, risks permanently endorsing the narrative that Iran can sink an American carrier and negotiate rather than face military extinction. The escalation option, deploying nuclear weapons or threatening their use explicitly, risks the Chinese and Russian responses that have been calibrated and positioned throughout this series and that both nations have communicated. Through the diplomatic channels this series has tracked, represent absolute red lines whose crossing triggers responses that make every previous financial market movement in this series look trivial. All three options are available. All three options are terrible. And the President of the United States is choosing between them right now, in real time, while the Nimitz settles into the sediment of the Arabian Sea floor and financial markets continue to move in ways that make every minute of indecision incrementally more expensive. This is the strategic trap that Iran built across 12 episodes of this series, not with a single brilliant move, not with one devastating strike, but with 12 sequential episodes of escalation, each one carefully calibrated to move the conflict one step closer to the moment when every American response option carries a cost that makes choosing it painful, and when the least painful option available to the most powerful military in history is the option that Iran has been offering since Episode 9, a negotiated settlement, mediated by China, on terms that give Iran security guarantees it has never been offered before, that give China diplomatic standing in Middle Eastern security architecture it has never previously possessed, and that establish, permanently and formally, that the unipolar world order in which American military supremacy operates without challenge or constraint is over. 19 seconds, 3 torpedoes, 1 carrier, and the end of an era that began when the USS Enterprise launched its first combat aircraft in 1962, and that ended, definitively and without possibility of restoration, when the USS Nimitz hit the bottom of the Arabian Sea at 03:49 local time on a morning that the world will not forget. If this video has given you a perspective on this story that you have not found anywhere else, do 2 things right now. First, drop a comment below with your answer to the question this episode raises. Does Iran's negotiation offer, now backed by the demonstrated capacity to sink an American carrier, represent the most strategically successful coercive campaign in the history of modern warfare? Or does the United States have a response that resets this entire equation in a way that Iran's planners failed to model? There is no easy answer. There is only the honest one. Give us your honest take in the comments. We read every single one and we respond to the ones that make us think. Second, share this video with one person who is following this conflict but getting their information from sources that are not giving them the financial and strategic depth that this story requires. To be understood properly, share it with the person in your life who asks the right questions but is not getting the right answers. Because that is what Geopolitics Meets Money exists to do. And the only way it reaches the people who need it is if the people who have found it pass it on. This is Geopolitics Meets Money. 19 seconds, change the world. Stay sharp.